Welcome to The Shed Wireless, a podcast from the Australian Men's Shed Association, shoulder to shoulder, virtually.
On this episode of The Shed Wireless, hear the inside story of the COVID crisis response from the man at the centre of the action. The Federal Health Minister, Greg Hunt, will be our guest. We continue our series on the history of shedding. We're going to talk about social distancing from the refrigerator with Stuart, and Rip Woodchip will be along to nail it as usual. Hello, I'm your host, Aaron Kearney, the Executive Officer of the Australian Men's Shed Association. David Helmers is with us as always. Hello, sir.
Hi, Aaron. How's your week been, mate?
My week has been good, if busy. I do feel a sense of growing optimism that people just feel slightly less squashed down and depressed than they did a few weeks ago. Let's hope it's not a false dawn for everybody. I know you've had a really busy week because we are in very uncharted territory just at the moment in terms of the admin and logistics and processes with the men's sheds, aren't we?
That's right. Look, we've had a lot of calls there coming in, a lot of emails regarding some of the relaxations of the social distancing measures. And we understand a lot of the sheds are very keen to go back. And we discussed this last week about how AMSA had put the guide out there. But I just want to, while we're talking on this subject, strengthen the point when the men are talking to the COVID lines, the hotline set up, they need to be very upfront and honest to them of what the shed is and what they do, not try and elude with their questions to get an answer they want, so that they can go back at the shed. There is some significant fines at play, as well as COVID still is out there in the community. We need to protect all our members. From a more personal perspective, and the laws are being adjusted around, and local councils and building trustees may have some difference of opinions on whether the shed can go back or not as well. And they're essentially the landlord, but the sheds have to look at it this way. They've all been closed for a good 8 weeks or so now. Another 7 or 10, 12 days, whatever it may be, is just a bit of an extension on that. I'd rather them be safe than sorry, Aaron, at the end of the day, mate.
I think that's the real take home out of this, because we have seen gatherings of vulnerable people, and a lot of the sheds do constitute gatherings of vulnerable people that have really gone south because they've been mishandled, and we just don't want that to happen for our shedding community. So as David says, please err on the side of caution, team. And again, AMSA is there to support, not to give directives. This is the important distinction as well, isn't it? It's not like Vatican City is going to be handing down the word of God on this. It's very much all of the local sheds being able to drive their own reality.
That's right. There's lots of grey areas out there as well. So, we're getting lots of emails from people saying, well, this state says this, or this person told me that. Look, you've got to be sensible about it. Make a very concise decision. And if in doubt, just delay the process another week. Yeah. It's been 8 weeks now. Another week on top of that won't be the end of the world for them.
We're getting some fantastic feedback about how well the virtual connection has gone. It doesn't mean it's a substitute for the shed. It absolutely does not. But people have really embraced this idea of alternative ways to try and get shoulder to shoulder, if we can put it that way. So, as you say, another week of that won't do anybody any harm.
No, not at all.
We were rather excited last episode because we have, for the very first time, our own email for the Shed Wireless so that you can talk directly to the show. And it is theshedwireless@mensshed.net, theshedwireless@mensshed.net. And I was delighted that our very first piece of correspondence came from the other side of the world. Let me share it with you word for word. It's from Clondalkin Men's Shed, and it says, "Thanks, lads. Really enjoyed your podcast today. Nice to hear Barry, David, Ted, and Rip, all of their stories. And I'd like to know more of the new connect phase that Rip Woodchip talked about to keep us all connected. Thanks again, Tommy from CMS Dublin in Ireland." Hello, Tommy. Thank you very much for getting in contact with us at the Shed Wireless at mensshed.net. And talking about the realities, how they differ across Australia, they certainly differ across the world with the shed and the reopening process with COVID. I imagine that Ireland will be one of those challenging places to get back and operating in full anytime soon. Have you had much correspondence over there, David?
Yeah, look, I speak with Barry Sheridan, the Executive Officer of the Irish Men's Shed Association. Me and Barry have always chatted at least once a fortnight for the last few years, and we've got a very strong working relationship. In the last 2 months, we've been chatting, 2-3 times a week sometimes, and look, the sheds are in a very similar position to us over there. COVID has hit Ireland, very hard considering the small population of Ireland. They're not envisioning the sheds going back as soon as what we are over here, by no means. They're playing at a much safer line. It's quite tragic, some of the numbers coming out of Ireland. I've been over there 4 or 5 times, I think now. Supposed to go back later this year, but that's definitely off the cards now for the international conference that was going to be held in Galway's now being postponed. But look, the sheds in Ireland, I've always said the sheds all around the world are pretty much, they're all diverse, but they're all the same. I know there's a bit of a contradiction, but the thing that makes all the sheds different is the men within the shed. And there's some wonderful characters like Tommy out there over in Ireland that I hear from every now and then. I look forward to one day being able to get back to the Emerald Isle.
Indeed, and we're really chuffed that you reached out to us, and the invitation is extended to everyone. If you would like to have a shout out, just let us know that you're listening, say hi to your mates in the shedding movement, however you want to approach it. It's as simple as sending us an email. It is the Shed Wireless at mensshed.net, and the only tricky bit about it is Men's Shed has 2 S's in the middle, obviously mensshed.net. We would love to hear from you. David, our feature guest for this episode was not originally intended to be our feature guest for this episode. Unsurprisingly, as arguably in the top 5 busiest and most important people in Australia right now, the Health Minister took a heck of a lot of teeing up with Emma and the team behind the scenes, making sure that we did what was possible to have him on the show for what we thought was going to be Men's Health Week, which is coming up, and we're going to have a special episode for that in a few weeks' time. But once we did our pre-record, obviously his time was precious, it became apparent to us that really this conversation is so timely, it can't wait for a few weeks.
No, and look, the Greg Hunt, the Minister for Health, we're honoured that he took the time out, as you rightfully say. He would be one of the busiest blokes in the country, without a doubt at the moment. And he's also our funding minister for AMSA and men's sheds, and he's very passionate about men's sheds. So, I suppose it was no surprise, but it was a surprise, really, that he accepted our offer. I thought when we put it through, by all the feedback, he's the busiest bloke in the country.
Well, you'll hear this come out in the interview. Like the day he's saying he's often pulling 18-hour days. He got 1,000 text messages in one day at the height of this thing.
It would be unbelievable. So for him to take this time out and speak to us here today really shows how passionate he is about men's sheds and the men's shed movement. We're very honoured to have him.
So the original plan was this was going to be an interview that you heard in Men's Health Week as part of a series of special interviews that we have planned, but there's just so much timely information in it that we didn't want to delay it that long, and so we have brought it forward. You will hear some references to Men's Health Week that are obviously not happening right now, but the information that you're about to hear is very timely and relevant, and so it will be on point. We will go to the Health Minister, Greg Hunt, next here on the Shed Wireless.
You're listening to the Shed Wireless.
When the history books record the way the COVID-19 crisis upended life as we know it in Australia and how we as a nation reacted, our next guest is going to have more than a few pages devoted to his role in it all. The Federal Minister for Health, Greg Hunt, has been at the forefront of the Australian response. That responsibility and the fight to save Australian lives, I dare say, have taken a considerable toll on his own health. So we are especially honoured that he has found time to speak to you, the men who fill the 1,100 sheds across Australia, the people who love them, and many more around the world as part of this special Men's Health Week edition of the Australian Men's Shed Association, Shed Wireless. Welcome, Minister.
G'day, Aaron, and hello to everybody who's listening and everybody associated with the Men's Shed movement. And I know it's been a difficult time. The isolation and the distancing are so contrary to who we are, but they've been so fundamental to Australia getting to where we are.
I just want to ask, how's your health going right now?
No, health is not too bad. I was lucky that in December I'd been really on a fitness kick, and I always try to run or walk every day. I've obviously done less of it during this period simply because it's been, sometimes 18, 19 hours a day of consistent work. But what I'll often do, as I did this morning, is I walked for an hour and did all my phone calls. And so, active walking, phone calls, and then I'm still trying to get in, maybe 3 to 4 runs a week. They're really, they're about half an hour each. And sometimes if I can with my kids, they're 15-minute ones. So I've kept that up. I've lost a little bit of pace, but my daughter did a time trial with me and I was running sort of 4-minute 40 Ks in January. Then I was at a 4-minute 53K time trial with my daughter. She beat me. She's 15. She's very happy. I'm not. But so not too much fitness has been lost. A lot of sleep has been lost, but fitness is fine. And other people have real challenges. People have been losing their jobs. People have, nearly 7,000 Australians have contracted coronavirus. Almost 100 have lost their lives, beautiful Australians, mostly elderly. And so all of that puts my challenge into the perspective that I've got a strong, supportive family. I've got work which is deeply meaningful. And so the pressures, they don't compare with what people who have lost their jobs, are struggling with their businesses, or have had their health at risk or the health of a family member.
I respect that perspective and that humility. One thing that this crisis has done is made everybody look inward as to how they manage their own health, and that is equally true whether you're the health minister or in a shed in rural WA. Can I just ask again, at the interface between personal and professional, how do you make sure that you're the best version of yourself? You've alluded to daily exercise. Does somebody make sure you eat the right thing, or are you gobbing down 2-minute noodles at 11 o'clock at night? How does it work?
Well, look, if I'm at home, my wife and my genuine live-in Italian nonna, my genuine, our mother-in-law lives with us. They are both fantastic, clean cooks, and they, try to keep the family eating good, healthy food. And so, my great joy in life is to have family dinner around the table. I don't always get there, but when I do, it's a healthy meal and I'm there. Then when I'm in the office, I try to really have soup and fruit, maybe a little too much chocolate, but soup and fruit is the basis. I just don't like to work with a heavy stomach, and so that works quite well for me. And then if I'm doing phone calls, often I'll either put the headphones on or carry the mobile phone and walk and talk. And you'd be amazed at how much, light exercise you can do, but that constant movement is immensely important to me. So they're the things. And, I'm lucky that alcohol just really isn't a part of my life. I'll have an occasional glass of wine at home, but never in a professional setting and never in Canberra. I just made those decisions, some decades ago, and they've probably been wise. Just keeps everything very simple.
Yeah. Very much so, and allows you to compartmentalize. Perhaps we've walked to the edge then of mental health. Can I talk about your mental health in this current crisis? When you went into politics, I imagine that you did it with a dream of playing some role in your country's future, but you couldn't have imagined this life and death scenario that has been thrust upon you in the last couple of months. How do you come to terms with that?
Well, you're right. I never contemplated this situation. When I came into health on day one, we actually went to the National Incident Centre and talked about the structures that are in place and the processes. If there were to be a pandemic, an anthrax attack, a natural disaster, the types of things that we would do as a country, and then you learn more. And so I was fortunately well prepared. So being deeply engaged in the portfolio for now well over 3 years, I had the fortune of knowing where the pieces were. But what we really did, and this is where the work with the Prime Minister and Brendan Murphy, who's the Chief Medical Officer, and Paul Kelly, who's the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, was so important. We worked as a team and then worked through the National Security Committee of Cabinet, where there was a really rapid but formal decision-making process. So everything was tested, and we looked at what was the situation, what was desirable, and what was possible, and then what the actions were. And to have that process, which Scott would preside over, but he's done that for health, he's done that for economics, he's done that for national security, and he's done that for the Federation. And that's been deeply reassuring. Probably during March was the most pressure, when I was getting at some stage up to 1,000 text or phone or email messages a day.
Wow.
And so you're constantly working, whilst at the same time we were putting in place telehealth, the containment measures, and the private hospitals guaranteed. So that was the most pressure. But, for me, because I've got the exercise, and if I can see the family, that matters. Of course, you get, a little tense at times, but if I can get the exercise, I'm fine. For other people, this has been deeply stressful, and so Beyond Blue is there. 1300 22 4636, 1300 22 4636. Men's Line, very attuned with the needs of people, who might be over 50. They might have retired, they might have lost their job. 1300 789 978, 1300 789 978. And they're just two of the things which say this can happen to anybody. So if you are feeling stressed, no guilt, no blame. Realise that it's normal, it's understandable, and it's completely appropriate and desirable to seek help.
Really valuable for you to share that. And indeed, this very mechanism, the Shed Wireless, is all about making sure that there is a sense of camaraderie and connection and some pathways and some information. You've led us to Men's Health Week, which is what we are celebrating this week. What unique role do you see the Sheds playing in this peculiar corner of Australian health, and that is older men?
And I think it's immensely important. One of the sort of great joys of my job is that I have policy responsibility for the men's shed movement. And so by being able to support them, and I see it with the local sheds in my own area, whether it's the Southern Peninsula Shed, whether it's the Western Port Shed in Hastings, Mount Martha, whether it's at Dramana, and so many others, at Pearcedale. You see these sheds that bring people together. People have a fantastic laugh, mostly at my expense.
There's nothing more Australian, Minister, than laughing at a politician.
But then they'll do things like make rocking horses for disadvantaged kids. They'll be making toys. They'll be getting the pride of the craft, the generosity of the gift, and then the strength of the camaraderie. And it's a great Australian initiative that's gone around the world, but it's helped a lot of people. And many people have told me, but for the shed, I'd be in a very dark place. And I think that's a really important thing. The shed is a point of light when otherwise people might be in a dark place.
Would you agree that given the economic outcomes of the next couple of years imposed by the COVID crisis, that the sheds are going to have a critical role to play in the next few years? Absolutely.
And I say that because we know historically that wherever there have been economic downturns, there's strong evidence that there have been increases in mental health challenges. And that's especially associated with people who may not be able to get back into the workforce. And that can happen with older men, and that sense of purpose, that sense of pride, of independence, and it can be lost. And so people might question their self-worth. There's no blame here. And it's really important to understand if you're that person and you're not in a position of responsibility now, or you're not working and circumstances have conspired, then there's help to support you. Yes, Beyond Blue and Men's Healthline, but much more importantly, the fellowship of people around you who get that there are unforeseeable and uncontrollable events in life, and that we back each other. That's being Australian, but it's also being human above all else, that we back each other. And sheds clearly play a critical role. They're welcoming, non-judgmental places. And I think that's what's made them so successful.
And so at AMSA HQ, as I check in with them each day, they're being bombarded with inquiries, people begging for a pathway back to the shed. What hope can you offer?
Actually, quite a lot. We still want people to maintain their social distancing, which means, the 1.5 metres, the normal, friendly hug or handshake, which is so much a part of who we are. They're not really with us, I think, for the course of this year. We're going to have to practice those distancing things. But to get people back into the sheds, I'm hopeful that will come in either stage 1 or stage 2. But it's coming, and it's coming soon.
Are you, as you make that analysis, differentiating between rural areas where, for example, there have been very low coronavirus numbers as opposed to the areas that are more intensely populated? Are you making those distinctions?
No, we're not at the moment, because states are viewing themselves as an entity, and they'd like to be able to move everybody together, whether it's rural or urban. But there will be the capacity for states to choose to make a distinction between rural areas and others. But I think as a general rule, they're looking to move as a single entity.
And I'm reading between the lines on what you're saying, that when the time comes and a directive comes, as we have done so far as a nation and therefore been so successful in combating coronavirus, it's going to be really important to take directives from AMSA or whoever the other authorities are and follow those to the letter of the law to give us the best chance of staying open?
Yeah. So to give you an example, there are likely 2 requirements that would come with the first round. One is that there might be limited numbers, let's say 10 people at any one time, as a national rule on gatherings, and that you maintain that 1.5 metre distancing within that environment. And so, but they're quite achievable. And then it might move to a figure such as 20 in 6 weeks' time, or if we're lucky, a little bit earlier. And they're the sort of things that people can manage. So it's a case of we start carefully. One of the things we're trying to do is to monitor the impacts of the changes and to be able to manage them. We know that there might be spikes or outbreaks, as we've seen in northwest Tasmania or around the Cedar Meats example in Victoria, and to be able to move really quickly to test, to contact trace, to isolate. These are the things that are incredibly important. And so I think that the principles which we're applying, whether it's community sport, whether it's retail, whether it's cafes, whether it's sheds, other forms of community activities, sort of a set of behaviours, the number of people and the distancing, then an expanded number and the distancing, and then maybe we might move in the third stage to a more general limit on numbers. Mass gatherings in terms of the MCG or large numbers of people and international travel, they're a lot further down the pathway. Outside of Australia's borders, we've seen that the world is almost at 4 million cases officially. We think it's probably well over 10 million cases. I've said this before, given those that have not been diagnosed yet. So, outside of our borders, the world is a very different place. And so the only international border we can see an immediate move on, or immediate, for which we have a foreseeable move, is New Zealand. That will probably come at about the same time we move on some of the interstate restrictions in Australia. Those two things would potentially come together.
Minister, I know you have many commitments. We'll wrap it, but I just wanted to give you the floor for a moment. You have the ears of the men across Australia who are a part of the Shed movement. What do you want them to know for Men's Health Week?
Well, firstly, to thank you. You've done a great job in difficult circumstances, and some people will be in, small apartments. They might be living alone, and that situation could be tough. Others who might be, on a property with family and land, that's a far easier environment. So everybody's in different environments. Firstly, thank you. Secondly, please keep contact with each other. You are each other's own best supports. And so keep communicating. Some of us have discovered the joys of Zoom for the first time. Many will know FaceTime, or just picking up the phone if that's not your thing, to use one of those audio-visual ways. Just being in contact, calling the people that are isolated, reaching out if you're feeling isolated. And then as we do get back to the sheds and our community activities, embrace the moment, but don't embrace each other in a physical sense. Keep that social distancing. In all the world, even though economically it's been so hard, both in economic and health terms, you would rather be Australia than virtually anybody else. And that's the success of the Australian people. And if we've formed a once-in-a-century partnership between government, people, and the states, that's really something that we can reflect on and celebrate. And we're getting our lives back. They won't be exactly the same, but they're coming back.
Funny, you're not the first person to observe that. There is virtually nowhere in the world we would rather be right now. Not many people know this, Minister, but you've done a bit of metalworking and fruit picking in your time. Could you see yourself being a shedder one day?
I could definitely see myself, at a later stage in life.
Knocking out some rocking horses?
Taking time to come down to the shed. I spent a year of my life as an 18-year-old on a kibbutz in Israel. And I loved it. It was a really formative year, and it gave me a sense of the generosity of the world. I saw the harshness of the conflict in Israel. At the same time, I saw real human examples of generosity in both directions. And I lived on a bike for 3 months in the middle of that year, just knocking on farm doors in riding around Europe. And every night for 3 months, people would take me in, and I just had this great sense of ultimately an optimism about humanity, and that's never left me. And if anything, it's been reaffirmed during the course of this crisis. It's a pandemic that none of us ever believed would necessarily happen on our watches. We always knew it was possible, so we were prepared, but the scope and the scale of it and the speed has astonished us. But what's been more heartening still is the way people have responded. Australians have simply been magnificent. And to keep our culture and our sense of humour, I've got to say, FM radio has been a superstar in this. They're able to look at what's happening and give people a bit of humour and joy without the outrage or the self-righteousness of some. And there's this humour that comes with Australia, and that's a sign of resilience. And that resilience is what's got us to where we are, and that's resilience. Resilience is what's going to get us out of this, and we're on the road back.
Yeah, well, at some point, you're not quite ready for it yet, but at some point we'll get you to meet the Shed Wireless's resident character, Rip Woodchip, and he can have a yarn with you. But we might make sure everyone survives before we expose you to Rip Woodchip. Minister, thank you. Given how much is on your plate and the enormous demands on your time, we as a shedding movement really appreciate your availability, the fact that you have shown us the respect to give us your time today and that you see the value in what we do. Normally shoulder to shoulder, but virtually shoulder to shoulder through the Shed Wireless. Thank you for your time today and good luck with all of the challenges that lie ahead.
My absolute privilege. You take care. That
is the Federal Minister for Health, Greg Hunt, on the Shed Wireless.
Nailed it. Nailed it.
Nailed it with Rip Woodchip.
G'day, Shedders, Rip Woodchip here. How y'all going this week? I've just been out for a walk with my dog Charlie this morning. Funny how we can't even shake hands with our mates, but Charlie must have sniffed about a dozen butts during our walk. Maybe the vaccine for this thing is somewhere in the ingredients of Pal Pedigree. Well, the question on everybody's lips is, when are we going to all be able to go back to the shed? Much like the rest of you, I'm chomping at the bit to get back at it, and hopefully sooner rather than later, or else I'll either be up for a divorce or my missus will be up for murder. I can't blame her though. I even get on my own nerves sometimes. I do miss getting my hands dirty, but I can't say I haven't enjoyed the challenge of keeping in touch by some of the other means of communication. And the fact that everyone's making that extra effort has been pretty bloody inspiring too. I got a call from Bruce, the shed welfare officer, again yesterday, just to see how I'm going and to keep me in the loop with everything. He said all the fellas are doing well and keeping themselves sane and familiarising themselves with their family again. Most of the blokes have been keeping in touch anyway, and we've had a chat through the social media and the Facebook page and phone calls, and we still get the newsletters now and again too. Another thing is, I feel like I've made a bunch of other mates online over the past month or so, and I've been enjoying learning about what else is happening out there in the bigger, wider shed world. Really starting to get some momentum going on the shed online now too, and the different topics and discussions popping up everywhere are really interesting. It's good to see that so many of us are not letting all this isolation stuff isolate us too much, and we're all embracing so much of this new stuff that's available to keep us all communicating. Let's face it, fellas, we're all getting a little bit older, and there will come a day when we just can't physically get down to the shed, or down to the shops, or even to go visiting like we used to. I've seen it happen to plenty of our blokes down at our shed over the years. One day they're there, and then they just disappear. We don't hear about them again until the inevitable happens, I suppose. But there's always some kind of company at your fingertips, whether you're just out and about in the caravan with the missus, or laid up at home in bed for a bit. You just got to make the effort to give it all a go. There's going to be a lot of philosophising to come of all this, but for my money, I reckon the younger ones are going to become a lot more grateful for the things of old, and the older ones are going to become a lot more respectful for the things of new. Anyway, fellas, I ought to get back to doing nothing again, because I didn't finish it yesterday. All right, fellas, catch you next week. See ya.
Staying strong, staying sharp, and staying healthy with the Shed Wireless.
I was only thinking to myself the other day, could you imagine how many excess calories have been consumed across the globe in the last few months? Think yourself, right? How many more have you had, and then multiply that by the number of days you've been at home, then by the 7 billion people in the world. That is assuming, of course, that everybody has access to excess food. But there's an old saying, if energy in is more than energy out, then the difference can be found on the scales. So when you're stuck in your house with your fridge, the potential to eat and not move is huge, especially because so many of our favourite exercise options have been banned. So how do we tackle this problem, especially for what it means for our health? Well, AMSA's Men's Health Project Officer, Stuart Torrens, has been taking a close look at this, and he's with us once again. Hi, Stuart.
How are you?
Yes, I'm doing remarkably well, actually on the upswing, which is an interesting thing I've observed in myself. But setting that to one side for a moment, we've been chatting about the general mental well-being in the last few weeks, but mental well-being is closely attached to physical well-being, and physical well-being is closely attached to movement. And that's why we are talking about this subject today.
You hit the nail on the head. If you look through every health organization's website, you will see at the top of the list two things: diet and exercise. And they're the things that will stave off all sorts of ailments, diseases, and stand us in good stead for any attack from the outside, i.e. from things like the coronavirus. You're going to be way better off if you're healthy and exercised than you are if you're not, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely. And it's a quantity of life and a quality of life challenge. So just making it personal for a moment, you're in good nick. How have you gone about personally addressing this problem in the last little while?
Well, it was funny, Aaron, because your intro hit the nail on the head. I'm sitting far too close to the fridge.
That's what we need to be social distancing from, the fridge.
That's my next social distancing exercise.
1.5 metres.
I think I need to have about 2 blocks away, actually. So I have to walk to get there. But in that regard, in the last, what is it, 6 weeks, I've put on 3 kilos.
Is that right? Yeah.
And so your intro hit the nail on the head for me. And I have been trying to do as much exercise around the yard. I've been getting out and doing the gardening and what have you. But it's obviously nowhere near the amount of exercise that I did COVID and isolation.
Yeah, I want to engage on that in a moment, but just before we move on to the being too close to the fridge phenomenon, I know my kids are eating 5 times what they did prior to COVID, and I've taken to teasing them by saying, you're just playing Australia's favourite game, am I hungry or am I just bored? And there is that phenomenon as well, where if you haven't got a lot going on and if you kind of feel nervous, food can be a safe place or a bit of a false god, can't it?
Well, they call it a comfort food.
Yeah, quite.
And it hits a lot of people with depression, anxiety, loneliness, depression, all them sort of things. You look for something to hold on to, and a lot of people turn to food, unfortunately. And in this day and age, there's quite often not the healthy options available. You know, if we grabbed an apple, a handful of nuts every time we wanted to eat something, or felt bored or whatever, we'd probably be better off. But unfortunately, what we tend to go for are those snack foods, the sweet treats that are all around us.
Always full of fat and either sugar or salt, because that gives you that little momentary good hit before you don't like yourself again. But I want to walk back to what you were talking about before, and that was how much harder it is to have incidental exercise. So for some blokes, it might be walking down to the shed. For others, it might be gardening. For others, it might be walking down to the shop to pick up the paper. The isolation, by its very definition, has meant a lot of that accidental exercise has gone away.
It has, Aaron, but in saying that, what our focus from the Span of Teams perspective has been this year is on diet and exercise. And it's doing the little extras, that little extra step, the little extra push. So when you do have to go and buy toilet paper, go to the supermarket, but don't park at the door. Park at the back of the car park where there's 101 car parking spots. And that little bit of extra will do you the world of good. And that's our push this year, is getting people to do that little bit extra. Like you were saying, the food in or energy in has got to have energy out to create that balance. Otherwise, it's going to hang around, and usually hangs around on the love handles.
Part of what you're talking about there has been given a label and a name to help us understand it, and that is exercise snacking. And the point of it is, it's very hard to think about, a big slab. How am I going to find time for 10,000 steps today? But if you exercise snack, you can accidentally hit your 10,000 almost. Do you want to talk us through that concept?
Well, in that regard, I used to talk to people about diet and exercise when I worked with Alzheimer's Australia in New South Wales, because diet and exercise in particular increases the blood circulation through the body and therefore is good for the brain and staving off dementia growth. So it's a matter of focusing on those small bits of exercise that you can do. You might not be physically able to run around the block or run a marathon, but if you do 2 or 3 more steps every time you do an activity, those little bite-sized chunks will help you in the long run. Put it this way, if you don't do them, you're going to suffer for it.
They say the target is half an hour a day. That isn't a big number, even though many of us go, it's hard to exercise. Half an hour is, 1/48th of any given day.
Having said that, that's half an hour throughout the whole day.
Yeah, quite.
So if you can break that down into little bite-sized chunks of 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there, do a little bit of stretching, hold on to the back of a chair and do some squats. Whatever the exercise will be. I used to actually promote a type of exercise called kinesthetic exercise where you don't even have to get off your butt.
Go on.
You can sit there and squeeze areas of your body. So let's say your stomach muscles. You clench your stomach muscles, and whilst continuing to breathe, you count to 10 and then you relax. You relax for 5, then you tense the muscles again, count to 10. This is exercising those muscles without actually having to move. We can all clench the muscle groups throughout our body. Clench your butt cheeks is one of the things I used to get the audience to do because they all used to giggle at it. And then I would forget to tell them to relax at the end and then finish my talk.
So everyone was walking around like Jean-Claude Van Damme by the end of it.
They had very strong butt cheeks and a smile on their face and a lot of questions for me.
Well, generally when we're having a chat here, we issue some sort of a challenge. We won't issue the challenge of everybody clenching their butt cheeks until the next episode. Although if you want to take up that challenge, what you do on your own time is up to you, ladies and gentlemen. However, do you have a little bit of a challenge, something proactive that we can do that tackles some of the issues that we've raised here?
Okay, so in regards to stepping it up, stepping out, be active, we have Exercise Right, doing a podcast on active at any age. That podcast is coming out on the 20th of June by Healthy Male.
Great.
We'll tell you more about that on our website. But in the interim, anything that you do, any sort of walking around the house, take it a few more steps. Add a little bit more. So if you're going to empty the dishwasher, for instance, instead of holding a pile of plates and taking that part, take each individual plate to the cupboard. And that will give you that extra exercise backwards and forwards. If you're cooking a meal, go to the fridge for each and every item, backwards and forwards. That will increase the amount of exercise that you do during the day without having to go out and run around the block or run around a marathon. I watched a very funny video where a gentleman put soapy water on the floor and then pushed up against the place. And basically, he created his own treadmill.
I saw that too.
But you could do that with a pair of socks on a vinyl floor. Exactly the same sort of thing. You don't have to create the mess. But that little bit more will stand you in good stead.
And it is a slight mental shift because it is human nature to find the shortcut, to find the quickest, most efficient, in inverted commas, way of doing things. And what you're actually advising there is efficiency is about hardwiring a bit more movement in. And so it will take a slight shift, but you'll be surprised how quickly half an hour a day turns up. Thank you for the challenge, Stu. Thank you for your company this week. We will talk to you again very soon. That is AMSA's Men's Health Project Officer, Stuart Torrance.
Thanks, Aaron.
If you're experiencing a mental health crisis, you can call Lifeline Australia on 13 11 14 or Men's Line on 1300 99 7899. That's 1300 99 7899. If you would like to check out all of the national health lines, you can just Google up Beyond Blue. And if you are concerned about the health and safety of yourself, family or friends, you can find government advice on coronavirus and a helpline for coronavirus at 1-800-020-080. That's 1-800-020-080.
Now on the Shed Wireless, let's see who's working in the shed.
To find out who is working in the shed, we're heading back to AMSA headquarters this week, where we find the man who crunches all the numbers. Mark Lilly has been an auditor at an international firm. He's worked as the business manager for a government environmental agency. He's a chartered accountant and registered tax agent with more than 35 years' experience in the accounting profession. But these days, he is the finance manager at the Australian Men's Shed Association. And if you have had cause to have a financial inquiry at any point, you have very probably met Mark. Indeed, you probably have if you've been to one of the national conferences as well. Welcome to the Shed Wireless, Mark.
Oh, thanks very much, Aaron, and thanks for the lovely introduction.
It's really nice to catch up with you. We don't do it often enough, but I have to be professional. I have to be hard-hitting in this interview, Mark. I'm going straight for the jugular first up.
Well, that wasn't the deal at all, Aaron.
I'm afraid I'm afraid my journalistic instincts are strong. I need to know, how do you manage to keep your job when you are so much better at golf than the executive officer, David Helmers?
Well, that's not easy. I try to give him a tip every now and then, but he's actually better than he thinks. I think he gets down on himself, but he's a pleasure to play with, and I think he gets a real thrill that he can outdrive me by at least 30 metres on every hole. So that keeps him going.
So is that your style, short and straight, as opposed to the Helmers long and loose?
Unfortunately, Aaron, it is. I'd like to be more flamboyant, and I'd love another 30 metres in my drives, but it just doesn't seem to happen.
Have you been a lifelong golfer?
Mum and Dad live near Pennant Hills Golf Course in Sydney, and I was looking to, being a true accountant, I was looking to earn some money when I was 9 or 10 years old. But Dad would only give us 20 cents pocket money, which is really nothing.
It was more then than it is now, to be fair. But
that's true, but it still didn't go that far. So we saw the golf course as a source of income initially, and had a friend that used to go caddying there. We hooked on with him, started caddying. So I've been associated with golf for a long time, since I was 9. I won't tell you how many years that is because it's too long to say.
That's interesting. How much do you think you picked up by osmosis, just by spending that time watching other, I guess predominantly men, was it, having a swing and seeing what worked and what didn't? Do you think you picked up a lot of it just by observation?
Oh, that's exactly right, Aaron. I've only really I wouldn't have had more than half a dozen lessons in my whole life. So I picked up the whole lot through osmosis and having the odd golf book and reading that. But even now, all these years later, I'm still learning, which is the beauty of golf. It's a game. It's a lifelong game where you're always challenged and you're always learning. And David Helmers would attest to that as well, I'm sure.
It's interesting because there's a crossover with the shedding movement in that regard, because increasingly there are white-collar workers and ex-workers in the shed movement, and they haven't necessarily been steeped in a history of metalwork or welding or whatever the particular thing that's going on is, and observing people who are adept at something is a really important way to learn things, isn't it?
Oh, it really is, and it's a way of getting along with people as well. And most people are really encouraging, and they help you if you need help. But yeah, it's a wonderful way of working. And the golf club and the men's shed are fairly similar in that regard. It's you're part of a club, you're part of a group of predominantly men, and you're doing something that you all love. It's got the same foundation, and it's the beauty of the men's shed as well.
That's the love of golf. Where does the love of numbers come from?
Oh, people said, I've always said all my life I'd make a good accountant, and I always thought it was probably because I was a bit stingy. So that's, but I do love numbers, and I always loved numbers from primary school. It was my favourite thing to do at school, which is odd as it may seem. But I've been lucky that I've been able to make a career of it, and even to this day, I still really enjoy putting the financial statements together and lucky to deal with numbers.
Does it bother you that people associate accountancy with boredom?
Oh, I think it's very strange, Aaron. It's funny that people should say that, because I'm lucky that I can do that, but I feel like they're missing out, which makes it easier for me, because there's less accountants, because we have this perception. So I can hopefully then, I've been lucky enough to get jobs I've always liked and be good at, because the competition's not that great. So as far as I was concerned, like, long live that perception.
That's really interesting. Why? Well, first of all, why do you think that perception exists?
Oh, I think the perception exists because when my daughter was at school, every holidays I'd take her into work and she'd sit with me for a day and see what I do. And then when it came time for her to choose a career, I said, "What would you like to do, Em?" And she said, "I don't care what I do as long as it's not accountancy." She said, I can't stand sitting in the office for so long. It's too confining. I've got to get out and do things." So that was her whole motivation, not to do accountancy. And I think, I know, it's extraordinary, isn't it? So at least she chose a career which she was happy with and didn't choose the wrong career.
What did she go on to do, out of interest?
Well, she wanted the career totally opposite to accountancy. She wanted the career of movement and never sitting down. So she chose to be a physio.
Yeah.
Which, she really enjoys. And it is polar opposite to accountancy.
If then that is the perception, and if you say, well, what they don't know is good for you, what do you find the charm of it? Why have you chosen to spend, well, in excess of 35 years crunching numbers?
Yeah, it's a long time, 35 years. It's people that like puzzles, Aaron. I see accountancy as just doing a big puzzle. So if you like a jigsaw puzzle, it's the same principle. You really have a whole lot of numbers which are just floating around out there that belong to your business, and you need to put those numbers together and form a picture. And the pictures happens, you do this once a month, and the picture becomes the profit and loss account and the balance sheet, and it's just solving a puzzle and putting things together. And when you're doing that side of it, the financial statements, it's black and white. So you always get an answer, you always balance. So there's no ifs or buts or maybes. It's a clear answer and something that can be solved every month. It's a real pleasure to do.
And we can debate whether or not it's sexy, but its importance is not debatable, particularly if you're at an organisation like AMSA, where there are public monies involved and governance issues and those sorts of things. It's incredibly important that you get your job right.
Oh, it's incredibly important. It's incredibly important for AMSA, and we're audited each year, so there's certainly a check on what we do. But it's incredibly important for every business, every level of government, every organisation. So you would have seen the Treasurer on TV last night presenting some of his numbers for the government. He does that on a regular basis. And then you have the people in the men's shed, that each shed has a Treasurer, and they do the same thing with the different set of numbers, but trying to produce the same result, the same outcome, trying to balance the books. So we all do it. It's really the heart of every organisation. It just has to be done.
Why do you want to work for an organisation like AMSA when you could probably make a lot more coin, given your background, working somewhere else?
Oh, AMSA is a wonderful organisation. As you said, I've done a variety of things in the accounting world, but at my stage of life, it's really nice to do a community-based job, so that we're actually helping the community rather than helping other people just to really save tax or make money for themselves. So to do something that helps a community of men across Australia, it's just a wonderful privilege. The thing which surprised me a little bit was when I helped the shedders might ring up once or twice a week with an accounting question or a tax question, and I help them with that. And they're always the same. They're always so grateful and so appreciative of what you do. It's really quite heartwarming. But in practice, you just don't seem to get that. People really take it more for granted. So it's just lovely working for the shed and being a small cog in something that's made such a difference to people in Australia.
If this isn't too probing, why does making a difference to the community matter to you? As I say, there are plenty of guys with your background that just keep adding noughts to their salary every year. Why does giving back matter to you? Is it part of a personal philosophy?
Oh, it's just satisfying, Aaron. Like it just makes you feel good. If you do something to help somebody, it makes you feel good. So by helping other people, you're really helping yourself. That's how I see it. It's a really heartwarming thing to do. This is actually a true story. When anybody ever asks me, who do you work for now? I say I work for the Australian Men's Shed Association. And every person virtually verbatim says, oh, that's such a wonderful organisation. Like isn't that amazing?
You want to talk about privilege. That is a real privilege. I have a very similar experience, obviously, in this role. And it is one thing to carve out a life for yourself, and put food on the table and that sort of thing. All those things really matter. But if you can manage to do a job where people actually think you're making the world a slightly better place, or at least facilitating other people to make the world a slightly better place, then, yeah, I reckon that's winning life in many ways.
Oh, it really is. And I feel sorry for the accountants that work for the tax office because I'm sure they don't get the same response.
No, I'm sure they don't. However, I bet they tuck themselves in at night going, well, see that bridge that got built over there? That's because I did my job. Or see that over there? That's because I did my job. So we are all just cogs in the big wheel in some way or another. So you're good at golf. You're good at cycling as well. If you were thrust into a shed tomorrow and put in front of the lathe or some other challenge, how do you go with your hands, having been a man who's mostly wielded a pen in your life?
Well, terrible, actually, Aaron, which I'm really ashamed to say that because Dad was an engineer and we actually had he had a workshop underneath our house in Beecroft, and he had a lathe and he had every tool you could possibly imagine. And I've got 3 brothers, and they're all experts on the tools. They're fantastic, and they have their own sheds and could really be builders if they wanted to. But none of those skills were passed on to me at all. So I'd probably end up losing my hands, I'd say, if I even had a go at it. So I appreciate other people can do it, but it's a bit tricky for me.
Yeah, fascinating. Really good to catch up with you. As I say, we've known each other for a long time and don't manage to chat as often. We're not in the same room even now because of social isolation still being in place. But thank you for helping us to understand your role with AMSA, and we look forward to being in the same room. In fact, maybe even a shed where we'll probably be equally useless, maybe being in a shed in the not too distant future. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and I hope we do catch up soon.
That is Mark Lilly, who is the finance manager for AMSA, the Australian Men's Shed Association. And each week on the Shed Wireless, we find out who's working in the shed. Yes, it might be somebody like Mark who's at HQ, or it might be somebody working in administration somewhere, or it can just be somebody who is making sure that the shed doors get open somewhere across Australia. So if you would like to talk to us about what's going on in your shed, it's as simple as dropping us an email. It is theshedwireless@mensshed.net. That's theshedwireless@mensshed.net. Make sure you put 2 S's in Men's Shed. Tell us a little bit about who you are or who you want to nominate if you want to tip somebody else into it, and what work is happening in the shed that you're associated with. You're listening to The Shed Wireless. Time now to continue our journey through the history of the shedding movement. And we are joined by a legend of shedding in Australia. He is patron of the Australian Men's Shed Association, inaugural chair of the International Men's Shed Organisation, the author of The Men's Shed Movement, The Company of Men. Barry Golding was awarded the Australian Men's Shed Association Ted Donnelly Award in 2013 for his outstanding contribution to the shed movement, and he has been taking us through the history of the shed movement, along with Executive Officer of AMSA, David Helmers, over the last few episodes here on the Shed Wireless. Today, we're going to take a look at how what was a quite remarkable local phenomenon here in Australia managed to go global. Barry, at what point did you realise that the shed movement had international potential?
Okay, I was during the mid 2000s, early 2000s, travelling regularly overseas, and I talked to groups overseas, particularly in England, Ireland, and Scotland, as an academic about what was happening in Australia, and I was trying to enthuse people and get them to know about this stuff. But it's one thing for an academic to say something. Academics don't typically start bushfires. They're often shit boring, and I can be shit boring too. I should acknowledge that. I was actually travelling in Ireland, and I got an email from some weird guy called Johnny Boy, and he said, "I hear you're in Ireland. Can we catch up?" And he said, and I emailed back and said, "Well, okay, Ireland's a big place. Where are you?" He said, "I'm in New Ross." I said, "Where is New Ross?" And anyway, we ended up working out that he could drive from New Ross down south of Dublin, and we would meet at the Dublin airport, and he'd bring a few mates with him. And that 3-hour conversation really turned out to be very powerful in terms of the growth of sheds in Ireland. And as you know, David, by 2009, John came across to the Hobart AMSA conference.
Yes, that's right.
But we've done a fair bit of groundwork in the background in the meantime, you and I and others. But I think it's important just to acknowledge there were 2 New Zealanders came across to the Manly conference, and things had actually been ticking over there even before they came out here. And the first very early bloke sheds had opened at an old airport on the outskirts of Dunedin on the South Island, New Zealand, in around 2000 and 2006. So 2006-07, and so New Zealand was just starting to bubble. By 2009, Irish sheds were starting to open, and Age UK had started to try and roll out men's sheds as a sort of a top-down initiative, which understandably and fortunately didn't work very well because it just wasn't.
It was a spectacular failure.
It was a spectacular failure, but it kick-started the movement, and once it realigned itself, it's gone on from strength to strength, and I admire what they've done since.
The 2009 Hobart conference, I suppose, would be the next turning point, I suppose. It was a point where I think there was getting close to 300 men's sheds around Australia by that stage. And again, as you referred to the Manly ones, we even got more media coverage at the Hobart event. But I think it was quite significant from the shed's perspective and from AMSA's perspective then, as they actually started to really morph and take shape into what we would call the modern era men's shed. The next 900 men's sheds across Australia really were moulded, I suppose, on that modelling that was very much set in stone by 2009, Barry.
Yes, I think it really was important in that sense. It brought together people from all around Australia, and I think you'll recall there were people there from almost every state.
Mm-hmm.
And as a consequence of that, states started organising their own events, both regionally and statewide. And
yes, well, we did. If you remember, we did the Muck and Boodin one just a few months after that.
oh,
Who could forget that?
I've got the slide in front of me as I'm speaking. And you'll recall this tiny town in the middle of nowhere. And of course, at the 2009 conference, that was where you formalised a couple of patrons, including myself and including Professor John McDonald from University of Western Sydney. And you and I and John McDonald, and I think Gary Green drove
From Perth?
From Perth Airport to Muck and Boodin.
Mm-hmm.
And we were driving along country roads.
I drove and you rode in the back.
Yeah. And we could not believe, we were going down increasingly small roads.
Mm-hmm.
And we were looking on the map, and the place we were heading for, Muck and Boodin, was barely on the map. And we just thought this was some sort of weird hoax. And when we got there, they'd put, and what I'm looking at on the screen as I speak, is a picture of the Muck and Boodin shed with a marquee set up opposite and this blue carpet set up across the train line.
Yep.
In order to stop people tripping over when they're walking from the pub to the shed. And I think it's probably the only time in history where a train line has been shut for a conference with a blue carpet over a railway line.
I remember the whole town got behind it. We were all billeted out, if you remember. The amount of work that went into that event, because the whole idea was to hold a mini conference and take the key elements out of the Hobart conference and take it to the wheat belt in Western Australia. And the council were exceptionally, helpful and helped coordinate, and it's only a small council out there. I remember most of the people had, several jobs. I think it was the mayor who worked behind the bar and flew the helicopter as well.
Well, and there's a bit of a backstory to that conference. I was passing through Perth about a year before, and I met Anne Brandis, who organised that conference, and her father was involved in the shed. And she knew I was in Perth, and she said, "What would I need to do to organise a conference?" So I spent a couple of hours with her chatting, and she just went ahead and did it. And she did it absolutely brilliantly. It was an incredible coup in terms of, and for me, what it did, it showed that the movement was decentered. By decentered, I mean you could hold a conference anywhere, even in the middle of nowhere. And importantly, in the middle of nowhere, because this wasn't something that came out of the city. This was actually something came out of the countryside, came out of small towns, came out of suburbs, and was a gift to the Australian community. Could I just remind you, and of course, you'll probably be, that was the first time you and I slept together, David.
Don't remind me. Don't remind me. I'm still having flashbacks. I don't recall who snored the loudest, actually, Barry.
Just to clarify for those listeners who are concerned, we were billeted in single beds, but that was the first time we slept together, David. And that's
I think it's the only time I've had to share a room with you, Barry.
But Barry, so much of what you're describing there seems to me to be quintessentially Australian, that rural community environment, the idea of everybody putting their shoulder to the wheel. But those same ideas now resonate across Ireland, around the ring road of Iceland, various other places in the world as well. What is the essence of shedding that translates into any culture?
I think it's about men taking charge of their lives and their communities, and doing so through the shed, not just for themselves and not just for other men, but for the community. And that spirit of community building, David, you would have observed, is very strong. They have a strong tradition in Ireland of community development, which we don't have in Australia. We do community development organically, but they actually have professionals who are skilled and tasked at doing community development. And many of those sheds were got together through community development initiatives. And importantly, the men's sheds in Ireland boomed in 2009 and afterwards because there was a global financial crisis in 2008. And unlike in Australia, Ireland was just knocked for six by that. And there were a lot of younger men out of work. And as a result of that, the median age of shedders in Ireland was at least 10 years younger than the median age in Australia. So on average, men were around 68. In Ireland, it was around 58. And so they became powerful, A, because they were needed, B, because there was a strong community development ethos, and C, because it's decentered. And as you would have observed, if you were to get a map of Ireland and fire a shotgun at it, that's where the sheds are. They are not all in Dublin. They're not all in Belfast. They are bloody well everywhere. And they're everywhere because every little town has a need. And there's a lot of older folk, including older men, in rural communities in Ireland, as in Australia, as in Tasmania, as in Iceland, who need somewhere to go and something to do and someone to talk with. And that's why it's worked. And that's why it started beyond the metropolis in the first instance in most cases.
And I think too, the one that has surprised me over the years, or a few have surprised me. I never thought that Denmark and Sweden and Iceland, some of those countries, would take on men's sheds. But once I'd been to Denmark and Sweden, yes, I could see how it fitted into their culture. But I think the surprise one of recent years, Barry, is the actual, now we're starting to see the growth of men's sheds in North America. And, the US Men's Shed Association have done a great job so far of Americanizing the whole men's shed idea. But, for the US's approach to community and social welfare, I thought it wouldn't take on. But the way it's looking at the moment, Barry, I think the next growth area, men's sheds, may be within North America.
Yes, of course, as we speak, most of them, all the men's sheds in the world that I know of are in lockdown because of the COVID-19 epidemic. But beyond the epidemic, whenever that is, and it'll be different in different parts of the world, I do anticipate that there'll be a lot of people, in fact, a lot more people will be out of work. A lot of people in their 60s and men of all ages will have lost their jobs as a result of the COVID-19 epidemic. There'll be a long tail of unemployment, and there'll be a lot of older, unwell men, some of whom will never work again. And I think we need to anticipate beyond all of this current epidemic, there'll be a growth in men's sheds, and there'll be a greater need for men's sheds. And as you say, in places like the US, which has really been knocked for six in terms of its impact on communities, and there'll be a desperate need for sheds, even more so in terms of men's physical and mental health.
Yes, and that raises that the little project that we're currently working on together, Barry, along with John McDonald there, and writing a paper on where we sheds may evolve to in the future, and preparing ourselves for that. As you rightfully say, there will be a lot of unemployment. So we've managed to give you something to do in your retirement besides riding your bike, and put you back to academic studies.
That is where we will leave our journey through the history of the shedding movement now that it has gone global. And in the fifth and final part of our series, next episode of The Shed Wireless, we are going to look at this moment in history, this particular punctuation mark for the shedding movement, and how well the movement is positioned to take on the challenges of a post-COVID world. That's on the next episode with Barry Golding and David Helmers of the Shed Wireless.
This is the Shed Wireless.
And it's just about time to pull the door closed on the Shed Wireless for another episode. And we're encouraging everybody to keep the door closed on the refrigerator as much as possible as well. Hello to everybody who has us in their ears and is out walking, doing some exercise, snacking right now. The struggle is real, David. The struggle is real.
I've got a very intimate relationship with my refrigerator at the moment, and it's starting to show around the waist a bit, Aaron.
We need to put those X's on the floor like they've got at the supermarket that you can't get within 1.5 metres of...
Maybe a padlock on it. It's not just the food, it's the little tin cans that go with it as well.
Oh, my goodness me.
Get back to work.
For a man who doesn't do a lot of drinking, I can tell you I have added to the superannuation of the local bottle shop.
Look, once we're all allowed back and everything goes back to normal, it'll be time to sell those shares in the brewing companies, mate. Sales will plummet.
Absolutely. So coming up next episode on the Shed Wireless, we are going to bring you the final chapter of the Ted Donnelly story, the opening chapter where he started to, as the grandfather of the shedding movement, he started to tell us an amazing story. We paused in the middle of it and it's taken us a while to get back to it, but you will hear that next episode of the Shed Wireless, and you will also take a virtual tour, and I mean a virtual tour of the Parramatta Men's Shed. It's a really vibrant shed with a really interesting mix of men, and I think you'll get a lot out of touring the Parramatta Shed in the next episode as well. Thank you, David. Stay safe, and good luck pulling everything together in coming weeks.
Thank you, Aaron. You too, mate. Another busy week ahead of us. Thanks, Aaron.
David Helmers is the Executive Officer of the Australian Men's Shed Association and your co-host here on the Shed Wireless. Why don't you open your email right now and drop us a line. Tell us where you're listening, what you're up to. Send a shout out to a friend somewhere else in the shedding movement. It's the Shed Wireless at mensshed.net. The Shed Wireless at mensshed.net. Thank you very much for tuning in. By the way, if you go to the website now, where you used to have to stream from the website, it will now download the episode onto your mobile device. So we're trying to practice what we preach and make it easy for you to walk or move around the house or do the gardening while listening to the Shed Wireless. So if you head to the website, you'll be able to follow your nose and make that process a lot easier. Thank you to everybody who has subscribed. The response has been overwhelming, and to those who've given a review, because that is really valuable as well. We're delighted to have your support, and we hope you will be back for the next episode of the Shed Wireless.